we're going to build on the online module that you did. I hope everybody did their homework prior to today's session. We're looking to, actually that second bullet, we're going to save for the next session that we're going to do. Today we're going to spend more time deepening that understanding of what you learned online and how to address unconscious bias to prepare you and build up your skill set. A couple of community guidelines, so this applies to folks online and in person. We're not going to be doing as much pair and share because, but there will be opportunities for you all to individually contribute to the platform, and we'll have some interaction here in the space. The first one is just to try it on, be willing to stretch. If you are comfortable, that means you're not really in that learning and growth mode, right? So just, be willing to try new things, and don't get to the point where you're shutting down and wanting to check out, but do stretch. Speak your own truth is to essentially, when you're sharing, share from your lived experience, not from what you're guessing somebody else in your life or in this room might have been speaking about. Understanding the difference between intent and impact. Often, if we take a misstep, people are like, oh no, but that's not what I meant, or that's not who I am. We'll go more into depth in the second session about ways to respond effectively when you have had any kind of stumble. But essentially, we're just asking you to take the opportunity to learn and listen when somebody gives you feedback. Refrain from blaming and shaming others. We're all here to learn. We're all students always. Inevitably, every single one of us will not know a term or not understand that something is offensive. So it's an opportunity for all of us to learn, and we can only take those risks if we know that all of us are willing to kind of practice that embracing of each other. Step up, step back is just encouraging participation by making sure that if you're making a lot of comments or contributions, giving space for others to also comment, ask questions. Mindful listening, if there are those moments where we're doing some pair and shares, to just really take them, listen with your full self rather than anticipating what the other person is going to say. And then confidentiality, take home the learnings, and but don't share anything that somebody else might have shared that's a personal detail about them. And then lastly, stay engaged. So there might be times that you decide to pass, but we want you to still stay engaged in the conversation. Any clarification questions about this? Is everybody okay with these agreements? All right, so we have a little bit of a community norm around this. Everybody okay online? All right, first one we're going to do is just I know you've had a long day at work or wherever you might be. Maybe you're just getting up in your side of the world. We're just going to have everybody just stand in your seat, and we're just going to do a really quick stretch, and I'll explain why after. So we're just going to take a deep breath up. Reach for the sky. Maybe lean one way, maybe another way. Do a little head turn one way, the other direction. Keep breathing. Shake your head yes and no. Shoulders. And just shake it out. And have a seat. If at any point you feel like you just need a little movement, or feel free to do what you need to be able to stay engaged. I know it's a long day, and we're just going to keep going. Yes. So the stretching and breathing is one of the techniques that we'll go into that has been shown to be an intervention for avoiding bias. So I'll go into more detail when we get to that point, but just keep that in mind, that when we have more self-awareness and are a little bit more in our body, we're less likely to make those cognitive errors. So this is where we quiz you on what you remember from what you learned online. So Kevin is going to go around and pass the mic. Sarah is going to attend to folks who might have comments online. And this is your opportunity to tell us what you remember about what you learned from that 10-minute video. So that little tiny mini lecture, that the dialogue between Professor Don Moore and myself. Anybody? Hold on, we're using the microphones because we're doing this online.
Okay, I'm a double alumni, and what I learned is a lot of things in that, but a few things were like there's a concept of bias, and we tend to apply that unconsciously, and then there are some ways you can overcome that.
Thank you. Anyone else have what you remember from the online video? Anything?
The thing I remember most is probably the fact that unconscious bias can often impact your behavior, but maybe more importantly, it can often be in conflict with what your own kind of moral compass is. So even though you don't want to have bias, you may unconsciously have pulled in kind of what you heard from your family, what you learned when you were growing up, what you kind of pull in from society.
Correct.
And that could be impacting your behavior in a way that you wouldn't want it to.
Yes, exactly. So that often they're not aligned with our values, and that they're often also ones we wouldn't endorse consciously. Anyone else have something they remember from the video? We're making Kevin get his steps.
My name is Alan, and I actually remembered one word that jumped out at me from the whole 10-minute. It was the word microaggression. Mm-hmm. And I've been thinking a lot about that word for quite a while. I just finished reading the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And so I kind of have a different perspective, I think, than a lot of people do about microaggression. And I'm just very curious to see how it plays into your whole concept of implicit bias and how it would affect me.
So that sounds more like a question, but microaggressions is actually our session 2. It's understanding microaggressions, the different ways that it's been categorized, and how to address them effectively. Thank you for asking. But in short answer is essentially that I think of microaggressions as kind of implicit bias in action, right? So we might hold some thoughts or ideas about other people not consciously, and some of the ways that it comes out in our behavior is through microaggressions. But I hope you come back for the second session. Do we have any online folks sharing some video recollections?
We don't right now.
Okay.
But again, we encourage people to submit questions, comments online, and we're happy to address them.
Right. Thank you. So some of the other things that I think are worth highlighting, good intentions are not enough, right? And that it's easier to have positive associations to privileged identities. And again, privilege and social identities is something that we'll go into in that second session. But essentially any majority groups across identity lines, it's easier for us to associate positive attributes to those folks. You have a question or a comment?
No, I was just going to say the other thing that...
Oh, hold on, sorry.
The other thing that really stood out to me was the idea that unconscious bias can be so unconscious, and it can be kind of pulled in from kind of societal norms enough that often kind of the minority group may hold those same negative connotations about themselves without realizing.
Right, so internalized racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. Yes, that many, and sometimes even more than half, have some internalized negative biases toward their own group that are unconscious. So just to give you a quick little review, what are we talking about when we're talking about unconscious bias, or implicit bias is the other way that it's often framed. Generally, we're going to focus on those negative associations, right, that one might make toward a particular group that are unknowingly held, right? That's the key. And expressed automatically without conscious awareness, so through behaviors. Stems from our tendency to organize social worlds. So what we mean by this is that our brain is designed evolutionary-wise to categorize, right, to be more efficient. So that, if I walk into a room, I see this, I know this is a chair, this is something I could sit in. And similarly, this little couch that's back here is also a seat that I could sit in, right? This tall stool is also a seat that I could sit in, right? And I don't have to individually look at each one and say, is this the same thing, right? My brain is designed to efficiently just say, this is all one thing, this is the function of it. And we do that, across a variety of realms. And unfortunately, when we do it to apply to groups of people, right, we're often committing cognitive errors, where we're lumping people together in a way of being efficient and then misattributing characteristics to people, right? So we all hold unconscious beliefs about some groups of people, right? We might not all hold the same unconscious beliefs, but we all hold some. And then I think all the rest we've already discussed. Certain scenarios activate unconscious bias. So when we're tired, when we're multitasking, and when we're in a hurry. So that little stretch that we did earlier was a way of kind of, let's all be here, present in this room and focus. Of course, along the way, you're gonna get a little distracted or maybe a little tired. Welcome. But essentially, that's what makes us a little bit more vulnerable. And so we got a lot of questions about the implicit associations test, and I'll address that, about halfway in. But just wanted to bring that into the room is that the reason some folks might have inconsistencies in their behavior or how those unconscious biases show up is along these vulnerabilities. And we have a comment back here. Do you mind bringing the...
It's working? Okay, thank you. I had a question about one of the bullets towards the bottom, favors those with privileged identities. So I also have a lot of experience, both lived experience as well as professional experience, where the bias is actually against privileged identities. So I wonder if you touch on that at all in this or a subsequent session.
No, what this is referring to is that the majority of the population who, whether it's through the implicit associations test or through other studies, indicate that the folks who have preferential outcomes are people from privileged identities. But we can discuss that maybe after if that's an area of interest. So I'm just going to go through a couple different studies that demonstrate the concept of bias and how it shows up in the workplace in particular, and then maybe go into some strategies and hear from you what strategies you're using.
These slides will be available later?
Sure, we can send them out as a PDF.
Okay, so then I don't need to take the photographs, okay.
No problem. Thank you for asking. Okay, so one of the ways that these show up, right, is imagery, right? So whether it's billboards, it's television, it's advertisements, we hear, these are the ones that make a big splash in the media when somebody really gets it wrong with, advertising for clothing or, those kinds of things. This is a college catalog. Anything stand out to you? Yeah. So, of course, when I see things like this, and mind you, this is from 2015, so this isn't like 1984 or something. And when I see these things, I wonder, well, who's there, right? Who's working for this, the company that was hired to design this cover of a college catalog? But also, did they have a voice? Were they empowered to say, hey, you might not, this doesn't quite flat, So, but it must have gone through a lot of folks who, not just on the designing end, but on the receiving end, decided this was a good idea to put on the cover of a catalog. And of course, there was uproar, and it was immediately taken down within, So there are a number of domains that there's compelling research about bias. Dr. John A. Powell, who now runs the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society here at UC Berkeley, used to run the Kirwan Institute, and they publish this every couple years, which is a literature review on all the various ways that updates on bias in all these domains. The Haas Institute also has similar foci. So one that kind of rarely gets talked about is body type, right? But I think it's one that stands out to me in the world of business and business schools. This is a study that was for psychology graduate programs. They sent out surveys to students that were already in their graduate training, so usually in their third year, applying for internship for their fourth year. and they asked to get a copy of their application materials, basically. So their letters of recommendation, their CV, so they had access to all the rotations they had done, and then asked for the BMI, which is the body mass index. What they found was that quality of the letters for students that had a higher BMIs was actually more positive. It was almost as if their graduate mentors anticipated that they might be facing some bias, so they wrote really overwhelmingly positive letters. But generally, quality of the letters was the same across the board, and similar credentials, yet they received fewer offers once they went through. So they were offered an in-person interview, but then once they went through the interview, didn't get as many offers based on BMI, and of course this was stronger for women. So this is one of those areas that I would just encourage you to start noticing and paying attention to. What are those attributes that you might make based on size in terms of motivation, or, there are a lot of attributes that are rooted in archetypes from like elementary school cartoons and those, childhood books and things like that. Not to mention, movies and all that. This one is one of those studies where they send out the same exact resume, right? Half the resumes have the name John, half the resumes have Jennifer. They sent this to faculty in the sciences, so biology, chemistry, and physics, asking them to rate, if you were hiring a lab manager, what would you say about this applicant, right? So same exact information. Faculty who are, objective, they're scientists, right? The other one was psychology faculty or graduate, hiring graduate students, right? So both, in theory, would be people that would be primed to be looking out for these things or have some awareness around this. But of course, what we find is that they were more likely to offer a higher salary and more mentoring to the male candidate. The female candidate was rated as more likable, but got fewer offers. When they asked, would you hire this person if they showed up, there were less offers for the female candidate, for the Jennifer. And then, that one got a little funky. This one has been cited quite a bit. The two researchers in Chicago and Boston took names from local birth records to kind of make it more realistic, and sent out 5,000 resumes in both cities, responding to a variety of jobs from clerk to like janitorial to executive. And what they found was for every 10 resumes that were sent out with like a John and a Jennifer, Brendan, they had a variety, Emily, they had all these like a little group of names that they were using. So for every 10 of those, they had to send out 15 of the Jamals and Lakeishas before they got a call back for an interview. And that was regardless of the level of the position. So before I go into that one, so I just gave you a couple of different examples in which bias shows up in the hiring process. There are a lot of different interventions around that I hope some of you in your workplace you've seen that would address these, and I'm wondering if we hear from the audience, both online and in person, the kinds of interventions or how your companies might be addressing these hiring biases. Do you have some online, Sarah?
The question that has come in is the question: how does someone feel empowered to address unconscious bias in the workplace when it seems that colleagues are turning a blind eye? So in the case of that college brochure, how do you bring that up when it seems that everyone in the room is just blind to what's going on?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So coming back to that college brochure, so if you don't have diversity in your team, that's pointing that out. But I also think, like, if you only have one, right, that isn't empowered, do they have allies? How seriously are they taken when they speak up? So I think, that has to do with climate and company culture and their willingness, their interest in motivation toward change and movement. So with them, of course, rather than preventative, it's a backlash, right? So there was a lot of backlash to this. Of course, it's easier for things to go viral, which then, of course, makes them take a pause and say, how are we responding to this? Besides taking it down and redesigning it, they need to take a look at who's in the room, who are they hiring in terms of the ad agencies or whatever it might be. So some of those kinds of things I think are in the aftermath, right? But preventatively, you would hope that they're thinking about what are those opportunities for diverse hiring, and to actually, have folks who feel that they can lend their voice, right? And some of what's been shown that helps with empowering folks is to have teams that have more like a check-in culture, where the managers actually start to build a relationship, listen, care about what's happening in their lives. They find that level of openness then results in folks feeling like they have more of a voice. Wondering if other folks have any thoughts about, addressing some of these biases. Are there things that you're already seeing in the places that you work in your organizations?
What one of my former companies has done is, in the hiring process, depending on the diversity of the team, require you to interview at least one woman and or person of color for each position, and you don't necessarily have to hire that person, but if you don't have a diverse team and you don't want to hire that person, you need a very good reason why.
So starting to require or hold hiring managers accountable for who is on their slate of applicant pool, right? And by doing that, you're doing two things. One is exposing them to the fact that there are candidates that are qualified that they've overlooked in the past, but also making them think about what are those potential contributions that these folks can make that are additive to the team. Anybody else?
You mentioned about how to deal with these biases. So it looks like to me that when people are young, that's when they should really get into this, understanding this, because then it becomes second nature not to have bias.
Yeah.
Now it's pretty difficult.
Well,
But still it's useful, I guess, all
Yes,
things being the same.
exactly. I mean, the more that we have exposure constantly over the course of our life, the more that our brains are plastic, we're going to continue to be malleable. And even those children who have exposure to a diverse group of other kids and along all identities, if they're also growing up with those images and messages about the value of those folks, right? So like we talked about earlier, some folks will still internalize those messages about their own identities, right? So it's not always fail-proof, but it is definitely a good start, because I'll say for me, I grew up in Chicago, and I'm Mexican. I grew up in a mostly Puerto Rican and Polish neighborhood. Was bused to a school that was primarily Korean and Greek, and there was a whole program that was for children with that were deaf or hard of hearing, and some had mobility limitations, and so there was a way in which I grew up with normalizing difference. Every kind of religion and food and new games that were novel to me, and everybody had their own language, and so. I definitely grew up with, by the time I encountered stereotypes about people, I had so many examples about how that wasn't, that's not true. I'm good at math. What? But I'll share some and feel free, if as I'm sharing these, if you think of the organization I work with, we tried this, feel free to share. So one of the kind of famous studies about an intervention that was done around gender bias was actually in the orchestra industry. They started to use blind auditions, which is, they used a curtain. So the rehearsal was done behind the curtain. I mean, not the rehearsal, the audition, I'm sorry. And not only that, they actually had them take off their shoes so that the judges couldn't tell if you were wearing heels or flat shoes as you were walking across the stage, right? So they were really thoughtful about this. And it really changed the demographics of the whole industry. And over time, initially it was just a handful of symphonies, and over time, it just kind of became the industry standard, right? So one of the things that gets talked about is, can you blind the resume, right? Can you have the hiring managers not see the names so that you don't know what their gender is, and you don't know what the, perceived nationality or ethnicity is of that person, right? Because, when you show those names, right, what happens is there's an assumption of not just about what their ethnicity is, but like, do they, understand English well, and will they have an accent, and will they be smart enough? Will they be lazy? All these things that get activated. There was somebody who, this was another kind of viral situation, was this Latino who, N of one, basically did his own study. He wasn't getting any responses to his resume, and he changed the resume from Jose to Joe, and suddenly got a lot of responses, right? And then wrote about this. And so there's all these ways in which those, the same qualifications might not even get looked at past that name, right? So blinding resumes is one way that that this is addressed. Another way to that language and job descriptions is one that gets talked a lot about, and especially with gender. There are things like, we want you to wrestle with problems, or be a, ninja tech something. Ninja coder is one of the ones that I saw recently, that there's all these ways that the language might sound aggressive or turn off some of the female applicants if it feels like what they're looking for is a male or masculine traits. The number of requirements, so women, the literature shows that women and people of color are not likely, knowing all the discrimination that is in place or historically, they're less likely to put their energy in applying to a position unless they know they meet all the criteria, right? So the more criteria there are, the less folks in that pool that you'll find that say, oh yeah, I meet all 10 bullets. Oh, yeah, 15 bullets? Yeah, that's me, right? If you can get it down to like 3 to 5, you're more likely to get a bigger pool of women and people of color applying for those positions. Where you do the outreach, of course, is another place to have intervention. So how are you going to require hiring managers to have at least one woman and one, person of color in your slate if you are only advertising it, posting it to your Slack channel and your fraternity brothers or something like that, right? Like, that's not going to quite get there. So finding where are those channels where you might have access, or job fairs, et cetera, that might be more targeted for other groups, veterans or people with disabilities. Merit requirements. So again, like, if you, from the outset, set what are going to be the things that you're looking for, what are the actual criteria to do this job, and not just inherit or kind of have some random wish list, and stick to that. Because, does it take an Ivy League degree to do this particular job? Probably not, right? But once you start to get those resumes and you're like, oh, Fullerton State University, or like, some Ivy League school or whatnot, then suddenly you're ruling out a group of people that are qualified because of some perception of the level of education or their ability to do a task. So just really thinking ahead of time, like where those biases might show up in different ways around class and et cetera. The structured interview is another opportunity to really rule people out when you have biases, right? So if you're having a casual conversation, you're trying to connect with somebody. If you have just a free form interview, then you really could ask anything and encourage people, even just by nodding, like, so you really like having a ping pong table at work, and and you were good at math, right? And there's different signaling versus if you have like a structured interview where the questions are aligned with those skill sets that you're looking for ahead of time, and you're not just kind of making up things on the spot that will bring out the best and encourage that applicant per se, because then we're more likely to do that with, like, oh, so you went to Berkeley. Did you take a class from, Professor Don Moore? And, where you find those points of connection. That oh yeah, this person was great. They were really lit up and they responded really enthusiastically, right? Performance on a job interview is not predictive of performance in the job, ever, right? this is where we have those opportunities to bias along, the size and attractiveness and height, So I'll keep going because yes. Oh, yes, sorry.
So if you, for example, blind a resume, when you get to the in-person, how do you prevent from all those stereotypes from coming back if there is no diverse hiring committee?
Yeah, well, in theory, the structured interview piece is how you try to intervene at that point. Some folks are looking at getting rid of interviews altogether, like I said, because they're not actually predictive of performance on the job. And so depending on what the task is, there's an opportunity to think about how can you get creative to actually measure how they would do on the job without bringing them in for an interview where they're sitting across from you and asking a question, right? So like in a tech job, it might be that you send folks, some code to look at and find the errors or edit or whatever it might be. Some places are doing more like you come in for like, a full week and you call it like a training of sorts, right? That somebody could walk away with like a certificate, but really what you're also doing is checking out how they would do if they were in the job. We have another one here.
I had a question. I mean, it occurs to me one of the things that I hear all the time from hiring managers, from HR, kind of multiple companies, is cultural fit, and that seems to me to always kind of be the if a candidate looks good and sounds good,
Right.
But you don't click, then the way you can kind of say that is cultural fit. I mean, I'm interested in what you just said about interviews not being predictive of job performance. Does that mean that cultural fit is really kind of not a true? Well, let's get rid of kind of or push the cultural fit as a stereotype and kind of way of getting rid of people that don't match who you are. But is there something to cultural fit or no?
Well, Berkeley is known for its culture, right? And we really care about our defining leadership principles, and it shows up in our interview questions for student interviews as well as for candidates, right? So we clearly care about is this person somebody who's going to fit with our culture, right? And this even when we were doing the dean search, it was a question that would come up. Will this person carry on the culture of the school? This is what we're known for. And so I think there is a place for aligning with certain values of a company, right? If they're going to be the brand ambassadors of that place, of that organization. And I think what's also shown is that it's often the excuse to not diversify, right? And so the opportunity is to look at, will they be somebody who enhances the culture rather than is going to just fit into the mold? Are they a culture value add, essentially? I think we can get away with it a little bit more because our very first the first defining leadership principle is question the status quo, right? And so somebody who's coming in that is a culture add really should be helping us push that boundary a little bit more, even within our defining leadership principles. And so that would be something to look for. Okay, so here are a couple more things to think about is that as an organization, having those objective indicators, as I mentioned, like the college university one is an example of that. If you have an objective indicator of what the task or the skill level is, then where they went to school to get that should not be as crucial, right? And holding decision makers accountable. So if you have goals for, having some specific metrics that the leadership is being held to, that is, following up, every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, whatnot. Like you gave the example of the hiring managers having to have justification for why they're ruling out somebody. And then this is more individual. So we got a lot of questions about the implicit associations test, so I wanted to make sure that I got to this. Two things. One is I wanted to clarify that the concept of implicit bias or unconscious bias is, there's a whole body of literature about that as a concept that is related to social psychology and those associations that we make. The unconscious bias literature isn't just about race or gender. It's just the majority of research has been done in those areas. But it's for everything from like industry or family roles, things like this. The implicit associations test is just one tool that helps you get at the sense of like, what does this mean for me? Where do I stand, right? And so we got a ton of questions, so I'm just going to try to zip through them real quick. Just to give you the overview, the implicit associations test is Project Implicit from Harvard. It measures the strength of an association between concepts, right? So if you clicked on the tests on the left, they were like the social identities. Those are the ones that, asks you like to associate like if a face is American or foreign, or if it's good or bad, or if you associate it with work or family. Whereas there are the experimental ones on the right, and so those are ones that often they do like there's a political campaign going on, so sometimes they do like political ones, or where you might have gotten like the flowers and the bugs and all that good stuff. Generally, the aggregate results of the tens of thousands of people who've taken the test map to the hierarchies and stereotypes that we talked about, right? So those privileged identities. And generally what you're doing is you're clicking really fast, E and I, and then you switch, and suddenly you have to do, and so one of the parts of the design of this that you might not realize unless you do several of them is that half of the people will get one iteration and the other half will get the other iteration first. So you might get black, good, white, bad first, and the other half of the group is going to get black, bad, white, good first. Right? And so then everybody does the switch. And when you do the switch, it gives you a little bit more time knowing that your brain is trying to adjust. And so they actually, in the measuring of the results, take into account that you switch the order, right? So they give you one extra practice trial after the switch, and they account for that time variability that it takes to just get used to the different pairing. And so then the result should be everything from mild, moderate to strong preference for one or the other, and sometimes neutral. So some of the questions that we got was, what on earth does this have to do with, what bias in the workplace? I don't understand how this works. Is it really measuring my bias, or is this just about training these associations? Would being tired or distracted affect the results? And if I had started one way, would it be different than if I had started the other way, right? So yes, generally what they're trying to measure is, or I should say what they're measuring is how quickly you make the association to one group versus the other, right? And the feedback is based on that. And that's, in essence, if you're kind of slow, people always tell me they try to game the test by either being more deliberate or taking longer. And then so sometimes it'll give you the results saying that it can't actually measure what you just did, right? But yes, being tired or distracted is actually, if we go back to those earlier slides, is when we're more vulnerable, right? So whatever bias we might have actually might be more magnified if we're taking the test under those circumstances. And then, just the association essentially is that one of the things that I want to say about this test is or I think that's in the next set of questions, which is what happens when you take it multiple times, right? And actually the test in and of itself one time is not predictive of behavior per se, right? It's that the test, if you take it over a period of time, multiple times, that aggregate is going to be what gives you a sense of where your bias lies, right? And the other thing about this is that it's not very good at predicting individual behavior, but it's very good at predicting behavior in the aggregate in a region, right? So they collect all that data if you were willing to give them your data on like what zip code you're in and these kinds of things, age and your ethnicity, et cetera. And so what they've found is, you know, and I don't want to misquote myself, so let me see. What they've found is that it's good at like certain areas that have, on average, more implicit bias and have larger racial disparities in police shootings, right? So they were able to say, okay, in these cities, most people have this bias in this direction. It results in differential racial disparities with police shootings. Counties that have greater average implicit bias also have larger racial disparities in infant health problems. So there are a number of studies. If you go in that same implicit association, Project Implicit, you'll see all the lists of publications of the findings that they've had. So in those aggregate patterns within a region is more what it's predictive of. Let's see. I think the validity is, you know, based on the tens of thousands of people, but like I said, it's not expected that it's like one time, one test equals you're sexist or something like that, right? Rather that it's like if you take it over time, you know, 10 times, 15 times in the next 6 months, and you'll see a pattern of like, oh, it's easier for me to associate women with family and men with work than the other way around, right? Okay, this is something I need to pay attention to if I'm going to be hiring, and in my mind, I'm thinking this woman should be at home with her kids instead of in this company, right? And then we already talked about the internalized biases that we have, even that along our own social identities, right? Did I get them all? But yes, they're looking at how quick you make those associations. Okay, so there are a couple of studies that have, based on a variety of studies that were individual interventions, then one study looked at compiling those interventions into a programmatic intervention along the lines of race, and then it was duplicated or replicated along the lines of women. Oh, wait, we have more. How do representations of the media and virtual so all these questions I will respond to as I get to what are those interventions. But essentially what I'm going to be showing you are that program. Like what were the interventions that they did systematically that resulted in changes in behavior. So the media representation is one that has a lot of impact, as we've talked about over time, that we're getting those messages unconsciously, and often we're just kind of moving through the world, taking them in and not stopping to examine critically, right? Like what you're seeing on the billboard or as you're in the grocery line, all those magazines, right? So the implicit associations test that does the women and work and men and family. So I'll share, like, I was one of those like little kids that off the bat, out of the womb, I was fighting all the gender expectations and constantly challenging my parents and questioning the whys. And when I took that test, it was easier for me to associate women with family and men with work, right? So I was like, oh, what? Not me? No way. You know? But then when I stopped to think about it, you know, even though most my female friends are doctors and lawyers, actually. It sounds odd to me at this point in my life, but that's true. They are also mostly moms too, right? And so when I think about like, okay, what's happening, like all those magazines at the grocery store, commercials on the radio or on TV that are for everything from paper towels to diapers, they're more likely to feature women, right? So I have all those images, as well as, you know, they have degrees, they're, you know, running their own businesses, they're impressive women, right? But it was easier for me to make that association. And so I would have to consciously stop and think about, you know, if I was in a hiring manager position, about what does that mean for me, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to immediately discriminate against women, but it says something about that it's easier for me to think of the men as people in the workplace, right? So I already described that. The 12 weeks of practice was the other outstanding thing. So the main things that they set up is awareness of bias, right? So we already went through the IET as one tool. There are other ways that you might be aware of your bias, like, oops, you stumbled and you called somebody something, or you were having a conversation with somebody, and in your mind you made an assumption and expected, that they would have an accent or that their name would be something, And so those are other ways that you might signal to yourself, like, oh, I had totally made an assumption about this person or the people from this group. Right? You have to believe that you are capable of change and growth, and this is for any change in your life, right? Whether that's an exercise program or whether that's a relationship, right? You have to believe that this is something you can do and that you can take on, and that it's going to benefit you, right? This is going to benefit you in your personal life, in your career, in all these different ways, and that you're going to therefore be motivated to practice to move toward change. It's not going to happen through osmosis, for the most part. So the first one is counter-stereotypic imaging. So imagining in detail a person that counters your bias, right? So if you're about to go into an interview, or you're about to go talk to somebody about their promotion and their annual review, one of the things that you might do is imagine in detail somebody that counters that stereotype, right? So if, you got the resume for Joe Hernandez, and everybody else in the company is white, you might imagine in detail either a famous person that's Latino, right, that is in that industry, or a friend of yours that that's successful, that's smart, that's et cetera, that's Latino, or just a generic Latino in a suit that would be capable of doing this job, right? So, but the key is to imagine them in detail doing that work that you're hiring for, so that when you go into interview the next 5 people, that image and that idea is present in your mind. That makes it more possible to imagine that candidate can be a successful candidate, okay? So you can do something like this, right? Generic folks, like, well, they're like all, happy and smart and, capable. So, or you can imagine like famous folks who are accomplished and leaders. And then stereotype replacement is when you encounter a stereotype, whether that's, you realize like, oops, I thought they were going to have an accent and they don't, or whatever it might be. Oh, I thought people of this religion were this way, or folks from this particular ethnic tribe in my country, or whatever it is, right? But the idea is that when you encounter it, if you have slowed down and can catch yourself, you can consciously then replace that stereotype in your mind with the opposite, right? So I'm going to show you a couple of kind of disturbing, I think they're always, oh, it moved. This is what happens when you go from PowerPoint to Google Slides. But the first one, is from the newspaper. It says, wife of Bears lineman wins a bronze medal today in Rio Olympics, right? So if you were able to kind of slow down as you're reading an article and actually trying to be a critical consumer of it, in your mind you can just replace wife with Corey. I forgot her last name, Codwell. So Corey Codwell wins a bronze medal. The next one's a little bit more disturbing, so just wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up. This is from Hurricane Katrina, so there's 2 articles. The first one says, a young man walks through chest-deep flood water after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. The second one says, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store, right? So clearly a very different depiction of the same behavior, but based along racial lines, right? If you're only reading one paper, you just take that information in and it just becomes part of that osmosis of taking in all these messages about who are these people and who are these people. So this was me replacing that stereotype, right? So I literally just took the words from the other article and put them in here. A young man walks through chest-deep flood water after finding a grocery store, right, instead of looting. So this question was about, does it depend on your pre-questions? So one of the things that I noticed, the implicit associations test just introduced this new thing, which is that they ask you, and I don't know if everybody got this variety of it, but they ask you a set of questions about one of the groups before you engage with the implicit associations test. And so There's the black good, white bad one that I've taken a number of times over the years, and I'll just give a little context of myself. I grew up being bused with African American school kids. I've had roommates in college that were black women. I knew, therefore, their family members, right? Their boyfriends, their husbands, their dads, their brothers, etc. So I have a very large community of black folks in my personal life. So every time I had done that test, it was easier for me to associate black good, white bad, right? So I was like, okay, I'm going to work on this association that I have, negative association, and not a lot of white people in my personal life, right? Then I came to Haas and have a number of colleagues, a lot of folks that I've met over time that, I have good friendships and really great colleagues. So I had gotten it more toward the middle. And then I did this. And when it starts to ask you all those questions, in my mind, all those examples start to come out, right? When they're asking, they kind of framed it in a negative way, do you believe that this, and all of them were negative about black, and I was like, no, no. I think I was so outraged that by the time I took the test, because in my mind then, I was thinking of all my friends and roommates and, all those folks in my life that I ended up leaning back toward black good was much easier for me than white bad. So it wasn't even that I wasn't, that I was thinking negative things about white people when I was taking that test. It was that I was thinking of all the good folks in my life that I care about that I think countered the stereotypes that they were asking about. So I don't know what variations you all took in terms of the kinds of questions you might have gotten, but I noticed that for me the results changed. And I think that it's in part because of that priming, right? Which is what this next one is. The priming is about obtaining specific information from group members. So typically, I would have us all kind of share a little bit more about who we are and what we're about and where we're from and all that. And I welcome, for folks online to share a little bit about themselves. I know we only have a couple minutes, but we only have one more strategy to go through. So I am going to give you, if you want to partner up, just 30 seconds each to share a little bit about either anything you want, 3 things about yourself. Something nobody would guess about you, something that you are excited about, or a hobby or something like that. Just share anything that you want for the next minute and a half. And for folks online, you can just share things among the group, whatever you want to share of yourselves. Okay, thank you all for taking a couple minutes to share a little bit more of yourselves. Essentially, what has been found is that I'm going to ask you all to focus back up front. I know we'll continue the conversation in Cafe Think for those that are in the room. I'm going to ask you to take a seat. So what's been found is that, I'm going to ask you to take a seat. Yeah. What's been found is that when you get specific information about individuals, the more individuals that you have that information, right, the more exemplars that you have of somebody, that you stop thinking about them as a member of that group per se, or only as a member of that group, but rather you think of them as individuals, right? And so the more opportunities there are to engage with others and get to know them, the better you'll start to be able to break down those stereotypes in your mind. We have a question up here, Kevin. Can you hold on to the mic? Yeah. Thank you.
So earlier you had mentioned that in job interviews, having that kind of conversations to find out kind of information to make you connect with them so that you can say whether or not you like them or not is kind of a bias. So where's kind of the defining line or the line in the sand between that and what you're talking about with individuation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with individuation, it's a technique that I would encourage folks to use primarily in their personal life with colleagues that are already in your workplace, right, in terms of creating a more inclusive climate, and so that there's less opportunity for microaggressions and stereotyping of folks that are already there. I think that there is definitely room for warming up a candidate when they're there for an interview, right? Everybody gets the jitters. If we're too nervous, our performance is going to decline, right? So you want to help them get to that level of that will help them convey best what they need to convey in that interview. But you can still standardize or structure that aspect. Everything from like, you offer somebody a cup of coffee, or you meet them at the elevator and you walk them through to give them a little bit of time to breathe and like calm down and just relax, and ask them, how their commute was, or something that is pretty innocuous that everybody gets asked, right? Oh, did you have any trouble finding us? Whatever it might be, right? That isn't about like, so where'd you go to school? And like, oh, did you go to last night's concert, or did you watch the game? Right? That automatically starts to tell you some other things about, so does how did you get here, right? Like, did you take the BART versus did you drive? Tells you something about them. But if everybody's getting the same question, it allows you to connect and warm up and bring it down a notch. But yeah, so does that help? Thank you. So finally, the last one is the slowing down and enhancing emotion regulation skills. So it's, like deep breathing, any kind of deep muscle relaxation, stretching, taking a minute to, take a quick walk. So when you're in your workday, finding opportunities to like just check in with yourself, right? To slow down, to not try to multitask, especially if you're about to go in to meet with a group of people or with a different, with an individual, whether or not it's a hiring situation or a performance review situation or just a meeting, right? You're less likely to make errors and make assumptions, and you're more likely to be open to take in suggestions or feedback from everybody in the room, right? And not just favor those that are easier for you. We have another comment over here.
Actually, as a teacher and then who teach international management in Asia, I'm talking a lot on stereotype, such as a South Korean, I'm teaching in Japan. And a lot of stereotype, cultural stereotype, and the stereotype in relation to norms about Korean in Japan.
Yeah.
When I've taught in the UK and Malaysia, also very different stereotype about Korean and who is working in Japan, kind of things. So if then, as you suggested, and then our main discussion is whether bias or stereotype is only negative one, that's my question.
Yeah.
And do we really decrease this kind of a bias or stereotype? However, when I've discussed the international student, usually they accept this kind of a stereotype. However, how we can bring this stereotype into our responsible discussion or responsible decision, that's much more important than decrease this kind of implicit bias.
Yeah.
That's
the
our
external
discussion.
behavior.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
my suggestion to address unconscious bias.
I think that's great. So one of the reasons that implicit bias has gotten so much attention is that in this country, there's this assumption that we no longer have this problem, right? Generally, that's the narrative. This is something that is, fundamental to our values and beliefs as a country, therefore we don't discriminate. And if you aren't getting opportunities, that's because you're just not trying hard enough, right? And so this literature got a lot of attention because it demonstrates actually we all are doing this and unknowingly discriminating against groups of people based on those ideas. You asked about positive stereotypes, and that's an argument that gets used a lot is, if we have positive beliefs about a group, is that then not a bad thing, right? That should be complementary. But in reality, it is part of that same spectrum that can be problematic, because if you allow yourself to believe this one characteristic is true for all individuals of that group, then by default, that means it's okay to think that this one negative characteristic is true of all people in this other group, right? And that's where it can become dangerous, really, because it's essentially a cognitive error. It's that we're allowing something to hold true for everybody, and never account for the fact that there's variability and that there's humanity, right? So even if the attribute is one that is in theory a positive one, it's not actually true for everybody in that group, and so it can be harmful for some who might need, who might have different needs. Does that make sense? Answer your question?
That's interesting. For example, what is the stereotype of Korean lady? So when I go here and there, the first question to Korean lady is, did you do the cosmetic surgery? That's the stereotype of South Korean ladies. So if then, instead of thinking this as a negative perspective of a Korean lady, so I suggest to the student and to the person who asked this kind of a question, why we have this kind of a stereotype to Korean ladies. This is because of the culture or because of Korean ladies' bad kind of emotional behaviors, or whether this is the systematic problems of Korean society or Asia society or even India, some kind of problems over there. So let's try to find the solution instead of decreasing bias or decreasing the idea of a stereotype. By having this kind of, the key point, we can develop.
Yeah, so I
And
think
yeah,
maybe what
that's
you're
my
getting at is
suggestion.
if there is a nugget of truth within a stereotype to address that nugget of the part of the population that holds for. And I think that will probably be something that we get more into in that second session, because one of the things that we'll be looking at with microaggressions is what is the underlying belief behind a comment or a name calling, and how do you then ask those questions that will help you enter in the conversation to understand what's behind that thought, what's a more respectful way to ask curiously rather than assume. So we'll get into a lot of that in the second session. I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up, and then we're going to continue the conversation for those that are in the room in Cafe Think. We've got a tab open and seats reserved for our alumni for some food and drinks. The very last one that I just wanted to share was the slowing down and enhancing emotional regulation, which is about just having some self-awareness. If you notice you're tense, what's going on? Are you uncomfortable? Can you relax a little bit, right? So that you don't act out or so all of that, just kind of keeping tabs, because I know none of you are sleep deprived or multitasking ever, right? You're never in a hurry. But I think just over time, the more we talked already about increased opportunities for contact, make it a little bit easier then to engage with a lot of different people, because you'll realize you actually have a lot more common ground than differences, right? And I think we're going to have to wrap it up here. Let's see, what just happened? I don't remember what else. Okay, yeah, I think I got through all of them. So I hope I answered all your questions for those folks online, and we'll continue the conversation. I'm more than happy to answer more questions. I just want to make sure that everybody's hydrated and fed. So thank you so much for your attention.